All right, so welcome everybody. It's so cool to see such a wide breadth of Christ's kingdom represented here and all the traditions that are here. Tons of different evangelical, mainline, Anabaptist, different traditions. So, um, the just on behalf of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, I'm just happy to welcome each of you to this second week here in Trevin Wax's online learning cohort. 5 challenges facing the church in the Western world. So just a couple quick announcements, and these are largely the same as last week, and then I'll hand the floor over to Trevin. And again, as I mentioned last week, we've optimized the room for the purpose of so that we can have maximum focus on Trevin's content. And so if you need to ask questions for Q&A, just go ahead and send me a direct message at MC-Michael Graham. And I'll be kind of collating and compiling those over the course of our time here together. And I'll put some of those I'll just, ask directly. Some of the other ones, if there's a lot of them that are the same, I'll do a little bit of culling and curating there. And then hopefully all of you got the recap email on last Friday. And so I'll be sending recap emails after every week that will include just the link to how to download that last week's session and all the previous sessions that have occurred before that in the event that you haven't been able to have that. A number of you have asked me, hey, can we have the slide presentation or a manuscript? And I think at this time, we're probably not going to do that here. I really appreciate all the people asking that and appreciate your patience. But we're probably not going to be furnishing those just for a couple reasons. But hopefully, having the recording is a good, kind of substitute for that. And then I know that I think some of the books have begun shipping. Our warehouse was they were working on inventory for Brett McCracken's book on the wisdom pyramid. So I'm not sure if the warehouse is waiting until that third book comes in before they ship all of them, or if they're going to send that out in 2 shipments. So as that becomes more clear, I'll let you all know more as that occurs. But with all of that being said, and again, if any of you did not receive the recap email from this past week, go ahead and also just go ahead and send me a direct message now with whatever email that you would prefer to have those recap emails sent to, and I'll go ahead and add that to my database so that we can get that to whatever most optimal email that you have, and so I'll add that to that. So with all that being said, I'm going to hand the floor over to Trevin, and we're excited here for week 2 in this cohort together.
Yeah, I'm excited to be with you guys again. Thanks for taking the time tonight, and I hope that some of you that weren't able to be here last week were able to still at least access the content from last week, because these weeks they're all standalone, but they build a little bit. So I think there'll be a little bit of help in trying to do that in a way where you can just review a little bit of what we looked at and kind of what we're building on. So as we started last week, I started off by just talking about how the church is in crisis, but that's always the case. And you can look back at the church through multiple times. I think we've got this impression that there's a golden era of the church at some point. And if we could just get back to the golden era that we've fallen from, then things are going to be better. Things are going to be different. I don't think that's actually the case. And I actually think nostalgia for a perfect moment in the past can actually keep us from faithfulness in the present. So I think we got to just recognize the church always faces different challenges. And today is just like that. We've also got to recognize that the church is always stable, that Jesus is doing his work. He's building his church. We are part of that. We get to be part of that. So the church is always in crisis, always stable. Yes, there's a spiritual battle. Yes, the outcome is secure. And these are fundamental truths that even as we talk about challenges, and tonight we're going to be looking at a big one, these are not insurmountable challenges. And with these challenges come particular opportunities. And the reason I lead off with that, and I just remind us that that's where we started, is because We don't want to have a fortress mentality. And I know if you guys, if you resonate with kind of the cultural apologetics of a Tim Keller, or, you've been involved in church planting in any way, or you have been involved in evangelism and mission, then you know that there's this danger of the church turning inward and making maintenance the mission, just kind of huddling up and holding on to what we've got. Like that's what success is. And if I'm trusting that everyone on this call knows God wants more for us and from us than that. And so that's the goal of these sessions, is for us to be able to look carefully at the world around us and to judge the moment in the right way, but then also to be able to move forward with knowledge and with understanding as to the culture that God has called us to be a witness in. So I'm going to start off tonight. We're looking at the second big challenge here in a bit, and I'm going to start off tonight by going back to C.S. Lewis. So those of you who read me regularly, you know that I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I actually have a post I've been working on this week. It'll come out in a couple of weeks, a column at Gospel Coalition about what C.S. Lewis got really wrong about the imprecatory Psalms, the cursing Psalms. Anyway, so I don't think that Lewis is right on everything, and he's a good critic, and sometimes he should be critiqued as well. But I'm a big Lewis fan. I mean, I got to spend 2 weeks living in his house last fall, which was like, for theology and apologetics nerd like me, was amazing. The house isn't, this amazing bed and breakfast kind of place. So I don't want you to feel like I had some student friends of mine that had been in courses that I've taught at Wheaton, who visited the Kilns, Lewis's house, a couple of weeks after I was there. And they were on their way there. They were like, "Oh my gosh, Trevin got to stay here for 2 weeks." And then after they got there and they looked around, they were like, "Oh my gosh, Trevin had to stay here for 2 weeks," like that kind of experience. But anyway, back to Lewis. Lewis is someone whose sharpness of intellect, and combined with like this devotional dedication, that combination helped him to put challenges to Christianity in perspective. So he did not shy away from the challenges facing the church in his time, but with an evangelistic heart, he spoke to the issues of his day, and he did so in a way that was confident in the enduring appeal of truth, no matter how dim things may have looked at the time. And we're going to look at some stuff that Lewis said tonight and show how much of what he was already seeing in the 1940s has become our reality, our normal, and here we are in the 2020s. But I think we sometimes adopt a romanticized view of the world of our forefathers and mothers in the faith. I think we can fail to fully appreciate some of the challenges that they faced head on, some of the trials they experienced. So to take Lewis as an example, he wrote many of his best loved works during the Second World War. And even after that, then he experienced, along with the rest of England, the years of austerity. Like those of us in the United States, like that's not really our background, but that after those cataclysmic events of the war, after they had passed, there was years in which they didn't have certain kinds of food for a long time and whatnot. And at the same time, he was committed to caring for a woman who became increasingly cantankerous. She was ailing and elderly by this point. I did a column about this at the beginning of the year. If you look up Trevin Wack, C.S. Lewis, Mrs. Moore, you'll find out about this. It's a really strange living situation, but towards the end of her life, she was just very difficult. So he was carrying these. He had a lot of health challenges as well. So he's carrying these heavy burdens during tumultuous times, and yet through all of that, is still able to see very clearly certain challenges and opportunities for the church in his day. And I want to give you an example that corresponds to what we're going to talk about tonight. Lewis noted that there was this decline of religion in England, and this was back in 1946. Okay. He saw this religious decline taking place, and he didn't think it was a good thing. In fact, he even said, that the absence of religious devotion, he thought, that could endanger the principles and the purity expected in public life. It could diminish the mutual respect and the kindness that political opponents would otherwise show one another. In other words, without Christian morals and values as norms in society, like with the decline of Christianity, things are going to get more vicious. But at the same time, Lewis was not a pessimist. He didn't just see that, he saw clearly that there was a downside of this loss of religious affiliation, but he wasn't just pessimistic. He looked deep into the darkness of that challenge until he saw a glimpse of light. He saw an opportunity. And I'll read a quote, show a quote here. He says, "I am not clear that religious decline makes conversion to Christianity rarer or more difficult, rather the reverse. It makes the choice more unescapable. When the round table is broken, every man must follow either Galahad or Mordred. Middle things are gone." So what he's saying there, in other words, Lewis saw that the loss of cultural Christianity did not necessarily mean the loss of true Christians. Instead, he would say, okay, well, the upside to this decline of religion in the West, it serves to bring into sharper focus the nature of conversion. In this kind of world, you can't just simply skate along as a Christian, like a Christian in name only, when the culture is very quickly shedding its culturally Christian trappings. The question of conversion remains. Its significance is heightened. So you can't just simply assume a Christian identity. You've got to wrestle with the implications. What does it mean to be a Christian? And this is a good thing. This is a good thing. So this is just one example, I think, where C.S. Lewis recognized with eyes wide open that there's a problem for the church in his era. And even though he sees that problem, he takes care to look for the opportunity that would come alongside that challenge. And I really like that approach. And I think we would do well to follow the same pattern. So when you look out at our world today, we want to understand, okay, what's the mindset of people in our culture today? Lewis believed that it was important to assess the state of society, to think about cultural developments. Some pastors are like, we don't need to engage the culture, we need to reach the culture and whatnot. We don't need to focus so much time on trying to understand the culture, we need to preach to the culture. And I'm kind of like, well, but the reason that you care about culture is because you love your neighbor. Lewis said in 1940, he wrote in an essay called Christianity and Culture, he said, if we are to convert our heathen neighbors, we must understand their culture. Now, we might today we have different cultural sensibilities. I doubt anybody is like using the word heathen in their preaching or teaching or just typical conversation these days. Maybe, a little less strident of a descriptor like non-Christian or whatever. But the point remains, it's out of love for our neighbors. It's out of a sincere desire to see them converted. That's why we look at culture. We care about culture because we care about people. You loving your neighbor means caring about the neighborhood, right? Like these things go together. And when we consider cultural views of Christianity today, there are some things that are in common with the landscape that was described by Lewis. But I would say that what he saw as something new in his day, that is now the norm. What was new for him is the norm for us. And I'm referring to this idea of religion in general, but Christianity in particular, the idea of religion in general as primarily a personal thing, a private thing. Like it's this source of strength and spiritual nourishment, but it's not a public truth that makes demands on every living being. So in the 1940s, Lewis saw the roots of what is leading to our present dilemma, and he noted that there was this shift toward pragmatism. It was part of the turn toward technology in his time, which of course has gotten even bigger now. But leading to this, there's this preeminent, most important question to be asked of all spheres of life, including religion. The big question is, well, what works? What works? And even back then, Lewis was surprised at how this obsession with the practical, he said it made it nearly impossible to discuss Christianity in the sense of truth and falsehood or truth and error. So here's what Lewis said. He said, in lecturing to popular audiences, I have repeatedly found it almost impossible to make them understand that I recommended Christianity because I thought its affirmations to be objectively true. He says they are not simply interested in the question of truth or falsehood. They only want to know if it will be comforting or inspiring or socially useful. And Lewis goes on in that talk to note how believing in Christianity for a lot of people back in his day was like saying, I believe in free trade. In other words, belief is just simply talking about, what you approve of. So when people are asked if they believed in Christianity, the way people heard that question and interpreted it was they would say that basically they're like, are you asking me, do I approve or do I disapprove of the church as like a social institution? And basically Lewis observed that judging religion based on the approval of what works and not what is true, well, that leaves Christianity without anything really distinctive. I mean, just at that point, you just got a Christian faith. It's in the realm of good advice, for moral living. It's moralism. It's not really the gospel. So this is another quote of his. This is from Mere Christianity. Many of you probably read this. He said, "Is not the popular idea of Christianity simply this, that Jesus Christ was a great moral teacher, and that if only we took his advice, we might be able to establish a better social order and avoid another war?" Now, mind you, that is quite true, but it tells you much less than the whole truth about Christianity, and it has no practical importance at all. There has been no lack of advice for the last 4,000 years. A bit more makes no difference, right? So I start off with Lewis because this turn to the pragmatic, the question of religion as practical, helpful, and socially useful. I mean, I think you would probably agree. This has become more evident since Lewis's time. And now Christianity is just, it's taken its place. It's just, among the variety of spiritual options for living your best life or fulfilling your potential or reaching your dreams. And so this leads me to the second big challenge that we're going to talk about for the rest of the time tonight. And I will say that we are going to, if there are questions from last week or those of you that caught up and you've got questions about expressive individualism, we'll be happy to talk about those as well. But the second big challenge for tonight is this. For most people, religion is a personal and private path chosen from a marketplace overflowing with various spiritualities. So notice that religion is a personal and private path. Now, so for a lot of people in our society, science is the arbiter of public truth and facts and observations. We see religion as an influence regarding values, but these values aren't absolute. They don't transcend your culture. And so what that does is, if you've got, Francis Schaeffer used to talk about the fact-value split. So in this sense, religion gets put in the upstairs category of values, not really facts that have anything to do with what's happening on the ground in the bottom story. So it's like Christianity gets thrown into the attic. It's a personal thing. It's a private matter. It's something intimate. It's something important, but it's really not something that can be out in the public square. It's a personal and private thing. So 3 ramifications follow from this pretty quickly. The first is this: privatized religion gets compartmentalized and can't really change societal norms and laws. So the impact of religion on society gets muted substantially. And I mean, this happens. Like, how many, you read news articles about this, or you hear commentators talk about this, or people keep your religion in your church, don't legislate morality. Like, as if there wasn't a moral vision around all legislation, okay? Or in other words, religion is seen as safe when it doesn't affect the real world, when or it's safe whenever you commission it in support of whatever projects are already popular. Like, you'll notice the double standard here, because religion is only dangerous when it's challenging a particular, political proposal that's unpopular, or it's calling out the injustice in certain laws or behaviors, or it's advocating for the common good as understood by the values associated with those, with those religious beliefs. But it's dangerous in that sense, but it's also useful if it's pushing along, what society already thinks to be true and wants to be true, and it can be kind of in the support role. So that's the first result. The second result is that the religiously unaffiliated, which, if you've seen the statistics or you've read the headlines, this is the fastest growing religious demographic in the United States. The religiously unaffiliated, a lot of those people are often still religious in a personal way or in a privatized way. It's just that their religious identities are in flux. They're mixing and matching various practices. Okay, so that's the second big takeaway. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard about the nuns, and by that, I don't mean like Catholic women with the habits and stuff. I mean, the nuns, those who check none, N-O-N-E, on a religious survey. This is happening in lots of parts of the West. It's happening in even surprising places. If you know the history of Ireland, Northern Ireland, it's shocking to see in like a place like that, for example. In 1991, for example, in Northern Ireland, only 3.7% said they had no religion. That percentage has grown in 30 years to 17.4%. Okay. Which, if you know the history of Ireland, that's just shocking. What you may not realize, however, is that even if those who say they don't belong to a religion, they're not part of an organized religion, they don't consider themselves members of a church, that they don't go to a mosque or a synagogue, like a lot of those people, those still believe in God. They still see themselves as spiritual in some way. They still pray or they engage in other spiritual practices. We shouldn't assume that that the rise of the unaffiliated means, well, now everybody's atheistic or agnostic, or hostile to the idea of God or Christianity. No, what's happening now, I'm not saying there isn't a rise. There is a rise in those who say they don't believe in God or are agnostic about that. There is a rise, but it don't assume that the unaffiliated, that's meaning that percentage of the population is now atheistic or agnostic. What actually is happening is something much more interesting than that. The rise of the unaffiliated points to a different phenomenon. What you've got are a lot more people who are seeking out spirituality in multiple ways and through multiple avenues. They're unaffiliated with an already established religion, but more times than not, they are forging some kind of spiritual path of their own. And this path is radically personalized. So I'll quote from a book, Strange Rites, Cultural Observer, Tara Isabella Burton. She describes the increasing number of people as religiously remixed, is what she calls them. And she says, and get this, this is the important thing, it's a shift from institutional religion to intuitional religion. Okay, do you get that? From institutional religion to intuitional religion. And that's really the core of what she writes about in her book. And this is how she describes intuitional religion. She says it's a religion of emotive intuition, of aestheticized and commodified experience, of self-creation and self-improvement, and yes, selfies. A religion for a new generation raised to think of themselves both as capitalist consumers and as content creators. A religion decoupled from institutions, from creeds, from metaphysical truth claims about God or the universe or the way things are, but that still seeks in various and varying ways to provide us with the pillars of what religion always has: meaning, purpose, community, ritual. Now, here's what I want you to take away from that definition, that intuitional religion. She shows that there's, this move from institutional to intuitional, but I want you to also see that that intuitional religion that she's describing there is in the institution of the church too. Okay, so this is not just a description. I would say that's not a description of just the religiously unaffiliated, those who are checking none on the survey. That's also a lot of people in our churches that are part of established religious communities, right? So there's this spiritual fluidity at work here where there are many church-going Christians who believe things that are fundamentally incompatible with Orthodox Christian doctrine. So don't be surprised when you run into this. It wasn't too long ago. I was in I was in a small group situation, and there's a faithful Christian woman who believes the Bible, rarely misses a Sunday service, churchgoer, got her Bible out. I mean, wonderful Christian woman. But in the small group session, we were talking about grief and some things and walking through pain and suffering. She was talking about the spirit of her grandmother in a bird and a butterfly. And I mean, thankfully the leader was really good and like gently corrected some of the theology there. But, I was sitting in there and I was like, I shouldn't be surprised, because there are men and women in churches all over the country. And this has probably been true of the church throughout history, but especially today, there are men and women who sit under faithful Christian teaching. And yet, without even knowing it, sometimes they're mixing and matching doctrines and practices from various sources as they work out their own beliefs. It's just, this is the world that we're serving in. Harvard divinity scholars Casper ter Kuile and Antti Thurston say this is an unbundling, right? So instead of having like all of things together, there's an unbundling of things like that initially would have been together in a particular religious outlook or a religious perspective. You kind of unbundle them and then you take what you want from them. And the result is, Burton says this, she says, the more individualized our religious identities become, the more willing we are to mix and match ideas and practices outside our primary religious affiliation. And here's the thing though, here's the challenge for us. Each of these intuitional religions is at its core, it's a religion of the self. Our desire for personal authenticity and experiential fulfillment, and that's building on what we talked about last week, right? Personal authenticity, expressive individualism, be true to yourself. Our desire for that takes precedent over our willingness to build coherent ideological systems and functional, sustainable institutions. Okay, so religion has moved to the personal and the private. We've looked at two ramifications for that. The third ramification is that the third result is that people begin to see their faith in terms of its impact on their lives, not its overall truthfulness. And that's one reason why we have the rise of the personal testimony that often gets treated as if it's the same thing as proclaiming the gospel. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. I'll explain what I mean by that. But Peter Berger, the sociologist, says this. He says, the pluralist situation is above all a market situation. Religious institutions become marketing agencies and religious traditions become consumer commodities. So in other words, the church's big focus is we've got to market what it is that we've got. We want people to come into the congregation so that they can receive the commodity of the religious and worship experience that we have. And so what happens, and this is actually part of our culture now, to strengthen the marketing potential of a congregation, the institution starts to focus its attention, often this happens, starts to focus attention on programs rather than people. And the institutional benefits of the church start to become more important than the flesh and blood relationships, the family dynamic, the family of God dynamic that really is at the heart of God's mission for the world. So the only way that all religions can possibly mean the same thing is if the point of religion is to help you become a good and moral person with enduring values. If the purpose of religion is just to make your life better, not to tell you the truth about our world, then yeah, why not judge a religion based on how useful it is? But you really only get there if the question of public truth gets removed. So back to Lewis, this is something that he saw. It was a trend already in his day. So again, this is a long time coming, and it's not something we're just going to change overnight. He was answering questions about apologetics back in 1945, and Lewis said this. He said, one of the great difficulties is to keep before the audience's mind the question of truth. They always think you are recommending Christianity, not because it is true, but because it is good. And in the discussion, they will at every moment try to escape from the issue, true or false, into stuff about a good society, or morals, or the incomes of bishops, or the Spanish Inquisition, or France, or Poland, or anything, whatever. You have to keep forcing them back and again back to the real point. Only thus will you be able to undermine their belief that a certain amount of religion is desirable, but one mustn't carry it too far. One must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement, which if false is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be, I love this line, the one thing Christianity cannot be is moderately important. Now, listen, Lewis would affirm that Christianity is not only true, but also good, even beautiful. In fact, I know he would have been happy to meet someone wherever they were in their spiritual understanding. And if at first a discussion of Christianity's beauty or goodness makes the most sense, then by all means, have that conversation. Start there. In fact, there's some new approaches to apologetics I've been reading lately that start with beauty rather than the truth question. I think that's great. Have that conversation. But what Lewis would not countenance was that you forever put off the question of truth. He saw through back then, and I think the problem has only gotten worse, gotten harder since his time. He saw through back then the tactic of pointing to flaws of sin in the church as it basically, he's like, that's a way of evading the facts of salvation proclaimed by the church. If you're always pointing to the sins of the church in the past, then you can evade the facts of the salvation that the church is proclaiming in the present. And by keeping the question only on the, by keeping the conversation always and only about, well, is the church living up to, or is the church failing to live up to her standards of holiness? I mean, those are good questions to ask, but at some point you've got this clear and burning question you've got to ask. Who is Jesus Christ? Like, what will you do with Jesus? So that leads me to what I would say would be, this is a big challenge, private and personal faith, but we had a huge, great opportunity here. We can proclaim the public truth of Christianity and call people to a conscious choice of Christ. And this is how we cut through the noise. This is how we stand out. This is also how we will attract some of the world's approbation, okay? Because it's not like the world likes us necessarily. But what the world is yearning for this, but they also don't want this to be the case. And we'll see when we get to the public truth of Christianity and its implication on morals next week when we talk about the question of Christian morality. But here, this is the question we're asking though. So we've got this challenge. We've got a world of remixed religious identities and spirituality. How do we respond to that kind of world in which the gospel just gets marketed alongside so many other personalized options? Well, for Lewis, the incarnation, God taking on human flesh, dwelling among us, is the central fact of Christianity. It's the central fact. And this is not just a religious view. He says, if the thing happened, like if God really became a baby, it was the central event in the history of the earth. He writes that in Miracles. So not just the history of Christianity, not just in terms of the impact on the church, not just in giving Jesus followers warm fuzzies, a sense of hope in the heart. No. If the incarnation is true, it is the most important event in world history, he would say. It is not just true in my heart, it's the central fact of the universe. So back to Lewis in 1945, he says the Christian story is precisely the story of one grand miracle. The Christian assertion being that what is beyond all space and time, what is uncreated, eternal, came into nature, into human nature, descended into his own universe, and rose again, bringing nature up with him. It is precisely one great miracle. If you take that away, there is nothing specifically Christian left. Okay, so one grand miracle. That is how Lewis described the incarnation of Christ. And he says, without this miracle, the essence of Christianity is eviscerated. I mean, trying to hold on to the moral implications of that moment without the event itself, it's like trying to sing a song after you've abandoned the melody, or trying to climb a tree after all the branches have been cut down, or severing a flower from its root and then wondering why it's lost its luster, why it's drying up. Okay. And I think the reason that Lewis was so insistent upon the historicity of the incarnation is because in his own conversion, this is what he came to terms with, the central reality. He learned from Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, and that all the pagan stories of a God sacrificing himself to himself, or a God dying and reviving, these were all these ancient stories that moved Lewis in his heart and mind. They were myths that resonated with him at the most profound of levels, but for a reason he didn't consider until a particular moment in time. And on the 18th of October, 1931, he writes this letter to his lifelong friend, Arthur Greaves, and he says, now the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference, that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth where the others are men's myths. This was the myth that became fact. This was a story powerful, not primarily because of its goodness and beauty, although Lewis, if anyone, loved to draw out the good and beautiful aspects of the story, but because above all else, it was true. So what does it look like then for us to present the gospel as public truth? We've got to present the gospel as public truth. If we're going to follow in Lewis's footsteps, we're going to be more countercultural in our day than he was in his. We've got to stand out by proclaiming something that cuts through the noise of all of these various spiritualities that are out there. We've got to be clear that when we tell the good news, we're not just We're not just delivering a message of personal spirituality, privatized religion, one option among many. We are declaring a public truth that has ramifications for all of life, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And here's where the church has an opportunity to sound a radically different note than everybody else that talks about religion. But we've got to choose to trumpet that news of Jesus crucified and raised as public truth and have confidence that people are still going to believe it. Now, I know you can find similarities with other faiths. I'm reading a book right now on some of the similarities and differences between Confucianism and Christianity, right? From a sociological perspective, there are various religions that are out there. There are alternative spiritualities. Right now, there's like this explosion in wellness rituals that are out there, self-care rituals. I mean, apps and meditation things and all sorts of stuff. And all of these things, like they may have good effects on your well-being, right? But this is what's different about Christianity. The gospel is not good advice. It's not a new ethic. It's not another option for just improving your spirituality. It is news about an event. The resurrection is at the center of our faith. And because of the resurrection, the gospel can't be squeezed into the same category as other spiritualities. We can't, but it's like sometimes because we feel the pinch because everybody expects us to keep it personal and private, we almost shrink it down into something personal and private in some of the way we talk about Christianity, as if we could make the explosive news of a crucified and risen Savior all about being a good person and improving yourself, or running society well, or the practical benefits for daily life. Sometimes I listen to panel discussions where there's different people from different religions, and sometimes it bugs me when there's Christians on these panels. The interreligious dialogue, sometimes I get the impression that Christianity is just a moral plan for being kind to your neighbor, or to take care of the planet, or to better your spiritual side. I mean, it just sounds so like self-improvement, community building that you'd get from a public television infomercial or something. And I just think of how different that is from the way the apostles talked about Christianity. I mean, in contrast to that, the resurrection of Jesus has to be the starting point for all Christian reflection. I mean, if what we really believe about the incarnation and the resurrection is true, that is an astounding turn of events. That is world-changing news. Nothing else compares to that. So you shrink the good news into good advice and you diminish our witness. One of my favorite theologians, missionary theologian Leslie Newbigin, put it this way. He said, "There can be no true evangelism except that which announces what is not only good news, but true news." It is a very serious matter when the gospel is marketed primarily as a panacea for personal or public ills. We believe that it is indeed for the healing of the nations, but it cannot be this if it is not true. So here's where I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier. I want to touch on, and I want you to hear me clearly here. This is where we got to be careful not to confuse the sharing of a personal testimony with the proclamation of the gospel. The focus of apostolic preaching in Acts is not on the conversion experience of the disciples. It's on the work of Christ that makes conversion possible. Okay? So in the same way, our testimony of Christ's work must at some point focus on what Christ did in history, not merely what Christ has done in our life. Sometimes I hear people say the way you share the gospel is you talk about your life before you met Christ, how you met Christ, and your life now that you met Christ. And look, there is a place for personal testimony. Please do not go off of this call and be tweeting and saying Trevin is against sharing your personal testimony. Look, Paul appealed to his experience when he was testifying to his uniqueness as an apostle. The Samaritan woman in the Gospels, she ran in the Gospel of John, she ran into town and she told of her conversation with Jesus, right? The man born blind, after he was healed by Jesus, he went and told everyone what had happened to him. So, and then again, we're talking about C.S. Lewis. I mean, he told his own story in Surprised by Joy. So don't hear me saying that we should stop giving personal testimonies. That is powerful. We should certainly do that. All I'm saying is we should work to make sure that the testimonies that we give about what Christ has done in our life, that those undergird and they support the public truth of the gospel. And we don't replace the public truth of the gospel with our personal faith in Jesus. If I were to put it this way, I'd say what Jesus has done for me should always be connected to what Jesus has done, period. I'll tell you where you get this is a point that is made so well in Daniel Nary's memoir of being a refugee from Iran. He's a refugee from Iran. He's writing from the perspective of a 12-year-old boy, and he's trying to explain the reason for his mother's conversion from Islam to Christianity. I mean, his mother, it's a great story. His mother he says she was such a fierce Muslim that she marched for the revolution in Iran. She studied the Quran the way very few people do. And then she becomes a Christian. And he says, and not just a regular Christian who keeps it in their pocket. She fell in love, he says. And so people ask him, why did your mom convert? And this is his answer. I don't have an answer. How can you explain why you believe anything? So I just say what my mom says when people ask her. She looks them in the eye with a begging hope that they'll hear her. And she says, because it's true. Why else would she believe it? It's true. And it's more valuable than $7 million in gold coins and thousands of acres of Persian countryside and 10 years of education to get a medical degree and all your family and a home and even maybe your life. My mom wouldn't have made the trade otherwise. If you believe it's true, that there is a God and he wants you to believe in him, and he sent his son to die for you, then it has to take over your life. It has to be worth more than everything else because heaven's waiting on the other side. There's no middle. She had all that wealth, the love of all those people she helped in her clinic. They treated her like a queen, and she's poor now. People spit on her in buses. She's a refugee in places people hate refugees. And she'll tell you, it's worth it. Jesus is better. It's true. Christ has died. Christ has risen. Christ will come again. The whole story hinges on it. I love that quote. And I think Lewis would agree. C.S. Lewis would agree. In a talk given in 1946, he said this. He said, Christianity is not a patent medicine. Christianity claims to give an account of facts, to tell you what the real universe is like. Its account of the universe may be true or it may not. And once the question is really before you, then your natural inquisitiveness must make you want to know the answer. If Christianity is untrue, then no honest man will want to believe it, however helpful it might be. If it is true, every honest man will want to believe it, even if it gives him no help at all. So do you hear what I'm saying? If Christianity is true, it changes everything. If it is false, it should be exposed as a gigantic fraud. I don't care how many people it's helped. It's not true because it's helpful. It's helpful because it's true. And so back to the testimony thing, all I'm saying is if you focus primarily on if we focus on our own experiences with Christ, we can unintentionally downplay the importance of the historic events upon which the Christian faith stands or falls. Someone who talks only about their personal experience with Jesus, I mean, they go, knock on a door, talk to someone, talk to a friend at work, and you're like, this is what Jesus has done for me. And then other people speak genuinely about their experiences with Islam or what particular Buddhist practices have helped them with, or particular Hindu rituals and how it's made their life better. So you see what I'm saying? Like this initial desire of just speaking and leaving it only on that level of what you've experienced personally, you were going to run into the rocks of multiculturalism. And eventually you get this neutered presentation of the gospel that loses any basis in historical reality. Well, let me tell you how Jesus has made my life better. And then they tell you how Buddha has made their life better. And then you're just kind of done, right? Like the role of personal experience, it's important. It testifies to the work of Christ. But that is just further evidence of the power of the gospel. It's not the gospel itself. It's what testifies to its power. So the same is true regarding our calling as Christians. Our good works flow from the public truth of the gospel, but those good works can't be the primary message of the church. And so a lot of times people they only talk about the good things that the church does and what Christians do. And I will say, okay, great. The church should be making the world a better place and the community a better place to live. But among all the good things we as Christians are called to do in our communities and schools and neighborhoods, what is the message we are commissioned to give? What is the message that explains our good works? What's the message that makes us stand out? And in some Christian circles, like if the message just becomes make the world a better place, well, then Christian proclamation has become wildly misdirected. No matter how many doctrines we say we believe, the focus has to be on God, on who he is, and what he has done. And the message has got to be centered on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And our dependence is on the Spirit who sweeps through the sanctuary and he does his work in the hearts of his people, you know. If we don't have that, then we're just a service agency. If we just promote and proclaim our own good works, you know, in the realm of social justice or political action or environmentalism or religious liberty or service to the poor, like what remains distinctively Christian? That's the question. So I do want to provoke you guys a little bit, challenge you here. There is another opportunity here that I think we've got to look at, and this one's a little controversial, and I'm not even sure the answer exactly how we do this well, but I do think we have the opportunity to refine the mission of the church. We live in a marketing world, and I think there's an opportunity there, even though I think it's dangerous, maybe. Marketing, the idea of marketing Christianity in the kind of world we live in opens up some ways of clarifying and sharpening our mission. Now, I know some of you hear that idea of marketing the church so that people would choose to follow Jesus, and you think, oh, that sounds sacrilegious, because, and I'm with you, the gospel is not a commodity to be pushed on consumers. It's a truth to be believed by sinners, right? It's public truth. All of that, I agree. And there is a way in which, if you think of Christianity like it's a product that you're going to market, you can wind up compromising the gospel. You can undermine the core values of the faith. I don't want to downplay the danger here. Sung-Chan Ra talks about how basically this is the problem that you wind up. He says the acquiescence to consumer culture means that churches fall into the vicious cycle of trying to keep the attendees happy. When a church entices consumers by using marketing techniques and materialistic considerations, is it possible to change that approach after the individual begins attending church? He goes on to say, or has it set up the church in such a way that the church attendee expects the same level of accommodation that was available when they were church shopping? And here's his question. Can a relationship that began on the level of an exchange of goods and services transition to a deeper level of commitment? Now, he's implying that the answer is no. If you start there, you'll finish there. That's just the answer. But I wonder if the answer is yes, it's possible. It's just going to be really difficult. Because I do think that it's almost unavoidable when people already see the church in this way for us to just tell people, don't come to church as a consumer. I mean, really? You can't, I don't think you can just, preach that out of people. That's where they're coming from, whether it's good or bad, and mostly bad, that is where they're at. So are there good opportunities in sort of marketing the church? I think there's a few benefits that are good. One of them is it can force the church to clarify its vision and purpose. Like a church and a leader has to ask, why does our church exist? What is our mission? You can't just, and this is a good thing, a congregation just can't assume its role in society. It can't impose its vision on others. And so the church has to make a case for, like, why is it here? In this process, even if it's a consumerist society that's kind of forcing us to think that way, I think it can be immensely clarifying for congregations, for people, for church members. Nigel Scotland points out 3 potential opportunities for the church in this scenario. He says it can lead congregations to clarify their vision, can lead them to better serve the people in their communities and congregations, and it can challenge apathy by causing them consistently to reassess their investment, their environment, and their strategies. So yeah, consumerism, like the personal privatized thing of just, making people's lives better, and they're coming to church as a religious commodity, all that's a big challenge. But there are some opportunities for the church to grow and to strengthen itself, rather than in the days where there was sort of a blind conformity and just the assumption of the church's existence. So the question that is before the church now, and I don't have all the answers to this, and I don't think we will fix this on this call, is how can Christians maximize the opportunity of the spiritual marketplace while simultaneously confronting its idolatries? That's the big question for me. That's like the money question that I think about that keeps me up sometimes at night. That's the crucial question our generation has got to answer in a world where there's so many competing spiritualities. But I want to move on and leave you with this. So we'll wrap up here and get into some conversation. On a trip to England a few years ago, my wife and I stopped by an old castle. It was built in the 11th century, and we took some family pictures. And within that fortress walls, There was a beautiful Norman church, and it was surrounded by a graveyard with really weathered stones. And the castle was amazing, but the church is what really intrigued me. And draped over the stone wall that enclosed the graveyard was a banner that was advertising a popular introductory presentation to the basic doctrines of Christianity. It's an outreach method that's used by different denominations in a lot of countries. And I saw that banner and it inspired me, because I was like, here is an ancient church surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. I mean, pre-resurrection bodies planted everywhere, right? And that church was determined to not just be a museum. And the sign outside the church communicated one message: we believe in Jesus and we want you to believe in him too. A couple days after that, I visited the church that C.S. Lewis attended, Holy Trinity Church in Headington, an old Anglican congregation, prides itself on the connection to Lewis, points visitors to the Narnia window. The church warden was great, treated us kindly, directed me and my son. We got to sit on the pew where Lewis and his brother Warney would sit. It was a lot of fun. And out of curiosity, I looked up this church online. But the difference between the First Church and Holy Trinity was striking to me. Here's one of the things I read online. This is several years ago. I don't know if it's still online now, but it says, we come with open minds and open hearts, doing our best to reflect honestly on the meaning of the story of Jesus for our day, and to welcome all who may want to travel with us without questions about past, background, orientations, or beliefs. This is not a church where you will find a fixed set of dogmas, but rather an encouragement to wonder, to question, and to value the views of others. Now, that last line about not finding a fixed set of dogmas, but instead being encouraged to wonder, I thought to myself, boy, would Lewis have a few things to say about that. Because it's very hard to imagine Lewis setting up a dichotomy between wonder and dogma, like as if a fixed set of dogmas is a bad thing. In fact, if you go back to one of his essays, Lewis called this minimal religion that was trying to shed dogma. He said the minimal religion, in fact, cannot, while it remains minimal, be acted on. As soon as you do anything, he says, you have assumed one of the dogmas. It won't be a religion at all in practice. It'll be merely a new coloring given to all the things, different things people were doing already. And he says the minimal religion, the dogma-less religion, will leave us all doing what we were doing before. See, this is the problem with a doctrineless and undogmatic Christianity. It becomes just a religious veneer for blessing your life as it already is. You could put it this way. Christianity without dogma leaves us with a tame God. Certainly not the magnificent Aslan, who's unsafe but good. Right? So Lewis says, the God of whom no dogmas are believed is a mere shadow. He will not produce that fear of the Lord in which wisdom begins, and therefore will not produce the love in which it is consummated. There is in this minimal religion nothing that can convince, convert, or in the higher sense, console. Nothing, therefore, which can restore vitality to our civilization. It is not costly enough. Now, listen, I know most likely the kind-hearted people at Lewis's church, they think that a fixed set of dogmas won't go over well in a pluralistic society, and that if you harp on Christian doctrines, it's going to be divisive. But what if the opposite is true? Like, what if it's doctrine that brings people together? What if the pursuit of truth is the only common bond worth arguing about? I think those who think that a fixed set of dogmas is bad are actually replacing one set of dogma for another, and they actually leave us blind to how dogmatically anti-dogma we are. Chesterton made the joke. He said the dislike of defined dogmas really means a preference for unexamined dogmas. And look, I don't know what the future holds for these two churches. The Church of England's in a tizzy over a lot of things right now. I've been writing a little bit about that in some columns recently, but I do know which church I'd rather join, which church has the closer connection to Christians all over the globe and believers who have gone before us. I know which church is closer to the global and historic witness of Christianity, and I know that because of the dogma we hold in common. So that's really what is something we've got to remember. Christianity, and this is the main point of the session tonight. It's not a personal adventure of self-discovery. It's not a patching together of our preferred versions of the Christian faith or the spiritualities that work best for us. It's the connection to Christians in various cultures and climates with different languages and traditions, but all who are united by a common confession in Jesus Christ the King. And I know, and Mike before we started recording was asking how many different denominations and traditions are represented here. And it's pretty astounding, actually, how many different denominations are represented in just the people on this call. But despite those outward differences, every true believer in Christ is connected by mere Christianity to all the Christians who have gone before us and to all Christians around the world today. We are joined to confessors across space and time. And when we say, I believe, we know we are in communion with millions of people who have found the same treasure, who recite the same words, who believe the same concepts, who trust the same Savior. It's when you just make Christianity something personal and private and just, that's when you sound like everyone else. It's when you align your heart to something ancient. That's what makes you stand out. That's the foundation we stand on, something bigger than our own invention. And listen, if we proclaim the public truth of Christianity, it's going to be tough. We're going to stand out, and we're going to make our good confession, just like Jesus Christ did before Pontius Pilate. And there will be opponents to this, and we'll receive mockery and insults and sneers, but we can endure all of that because we have the ancient church behind us. We've got the great cloud of witnesses above us, and we have Christ, our pioneer, before us. So we expect opposition. We don't shrink back from insult. After all, the mangled body of a crucified Messiah, that's the heart of our faith. So even if proclaiming the public truth of Christianity hurts at times, the worst that could be done to us has already been done to him. And we know there's an empty tomb on the other side of that future, on the other side of that suffering. We're the ones who recognize God's promises for what the future holds. And because of that, we can decide we're not going to be afraid. So, okay, so I'm going to shift back to Mike now, and we've got some time for some discussion, for some questions and responses that we'll look at from last week as well. Anything that we've got. So,
all right, first question. What I've noticed in my 15 years about the privatization of religion, particularly from thinkers like Os Guinness, Francis Schaeffer, Leslie Newbegin, is that scientists have become the new priests. If we want to fact check anything, we might reference a scientific fact. But the truth is, many of us cannot fathom the complexity of advanced scientific concepts. How do we speak to skeptics of Christianity about how this is just a new way to put our faith in the special knowledge of a different clergy?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Here's what's good and bad about this present moment. The science has been shown in the last few years to be moving really quickly and also highly contested. So the idea that you sort of just trust the science, this is a moment in our, for good and for bad. It's bad in the sense that scientists and people that are supposedly experts are joining the long list of other institutions that have shot their credibility in the last decade. So there's even parts of what I was talking about, science being the arbiter of public truth. I didn't dig into that as much as I might have 5 years ago, because I think that there's a sense in which today it's not been easier. This is actually an easier time to make the case that science is perpetually unsettled, that scientists are continually doing work and refining and debating and going back and forth, getting some things wrong and then right, and then, in some cases misleading. But so this is one of the benefits of the unintentional benefits of science also joining the other institutions that have lost credibility. Now, the challenge with that, the downside of that, is that we're in what we might call an epistemological crisis, where people don't know what's true. They don't know how to find out what's true. They don't know who to go to for their arbiter of public knowledge, and so we wind up in enclaves where we hear what comforts us or we hear what we want to hear. and that's really damaging for society. And it's one of the reasons why we have so many challenges in our society. So all that to say, I don't know that there's a really simple answer to such a great question like that. But I'm thinking now is actually I think people feel today a skepticism toward just when someone says the science says than they did it even 5 or 10 years ago on any number of issues. People are just not as trusting in that being the arbiter of public truth anymore, which again helps us in one way and hurts us in other ways, because there's an upside and a downside to that.
All right, next question. I like this one because I'm connected to the Made to Flourish network, so I'm really curious to hear how you would evaluate this one, Trevin. The idea of Christianity being pragmatic or good rather than true reminds me of the talk of human flourishing. I know a prominent pastor who's head of Made to Flourish network. How is trying to reach non-Christians using words like flourishing stay distinct from the pragmatic approach to religion that you have been speaking of, that Lewis noticed?
Yeah, so I want to say two things about that, or one thing really carefully about that. You got to start where people are. You got to look for the way in. And if the question is if the question being asked is what works, then by all means start there. I mean, Lewis certainly did. If the question is what is going to bring about human flourishing, well, goodness, the Bible speaks to that. I mean, read the Proverbs, read the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is giving us in the Beatitudes, the flourishing. I think Jonathan Pennington, one of my professors at Southern, actually translate, so I think it translates it that way. It's like, flourishing are the poor in spirit, because that's a key aspect of what Christianity does offer and what Christianity does teach. But at some level, the question is, it is possible to talk only in the terms of what works and only in the terms of what, makes for flourishing. It is possible to talk about that in a way that never gets to the truth question. And if you don't get to the truth question, then you basically are always staying in that realm of try Christianity as one of the options in the various world of spiritualities that's out there. So by all means, show that Christianity works, show that it's good, show that it's beautiful, show that, it leads to human flourishing. I've sought to do that myself in conversations with people. You've got to start where people are. I'm not down on that at all. I'm just saying if we stay there exclusively and we don't connect it back to actual history and what we actually are confessing as the truth about the world, then we're missing the distinctive message that got the early Christians martyred. The early Christians didn't get martyred because they were saying, try this, it works. Or try this, your life will be better. They got martyred because they said Jesus is Lord. And Caesar didn't like that. So at some level, like all I'm saying is I'm certainly not pushing against that kind of strategy unless that strategy is not connected to public truth.
All right, next question. How do you help people see that truth matters? My 29-year-old son finds that most of his colleagues are completely indifferent to Christianity. Not anti-Christian, but indifferent, which is even harder to deal with.
Yeah, I agree that it's harder to deal with. I find it much easier to evangelize, to share the gospel with people who belong to other religions than I do people who are just indifferent to the question of religion altogether. It's much easier for me to share the gospel with an Uber driver who is like a Muslim, who if I don't start evangelizing him, he's about to start proselytizing me. It's much easier for me to do that than it is for me to talk to someone who has just no interest in any kind of religion whatsoever. Yeah, what this is this is one of the big conundrums of our time. In part, I think because we have so many ways of numbing and distracting ourselves today from big questions, from deep questions, from the sense of loss, like the loneliness that people feel. We talked about this last week with expressive individualism. Like there are ways of numbing that with with our habits online, with the phone, with all sorts of things. And so I think but we think that's a brand new problem, but I think it was Pascal that said that one of the big problems of humanity is that human beings can't sit can't sit still in one room quietly for a particular amount of time, because it's like we've got to get up and we got to do and we got to we can't just be with ourselves and be with God, because then there's those pressing questions of life. So this isn't a new challenge. It's just we have probably more than at any other time in human history ways of suppressing the longings that God has put in our heart that would lead us to him. So that's a big conundrum. There's a couple of things I immediately think about. One is helping people identify, like I mentioned last week, the areas of anxiety that they feel. The good news is, I say it's good news. It's not, don't hear me wrong. There's a lot of really anxious young people today. Anxious in all sorts of ways, feeling the weight of so much. And they may be indifferent to Christianity because they don't see how religion would be part of the solution to the loneliness they feel, or the anxiety that they feel, or the mental health challenges that they feel, or the lack of self-esteem that they may feel, or the whatever it might be, or the lack of purpose and meaning and significance. So I think instead of trying to show immediately, hey, Christianity really matters, I think you may have to press in on those areas with a particular person as to what those areas of anxiety are and where those pressure points, and then bring Christianity to bear on that. So you don't make the case, just say, hey, Christianity matters. You start with where they are, and then you guide them toward Christianity. But that's really hard. And frankly, one of the things I've noticed in my life is that sometimes it's only when suffering crashes into the life and really explodes the illusion that people are then suddenly kind of awakened. It kind of wakes people up from the stupor that they're in, to where they may to where they will ask some bigger questions they haven't asked before. So not to say we should wish suffering on anyone, but sometimes, I mean, you can try to press on the pressure points as much as possible, but sometimes it's that outside crash that leads to those bigger questions. And so at that point, we've got to be in relationship with people. We've got to be ready, I think, as much as possible to break through the walls of indifference, and to let some of just the rhythms of life in suffering be our aid and our guide on that.
All right, next question. How can we effectively communicate the gospel as a public truth, which in its nature is a transcending truth, to modern individuals who perceive an insurmountable gap between the transcendent and secular realms, as outlined by Charles Taylor and alluded to earlier? I'm going to put that one in the chat. I'll read it one more time. How can we effectively communicate the gospel as a public truth, which in its nature is a transcendent truth, to modern individuals who perceive an insurmountable gap between the transcendent and the secular realms, as outlined by Charles Taylor, as you alluded to earlier?
That's a fantastic question. There's a book of essays that TGC put together a few years ago, I think, called Our Secular Age, that's interacting with that. I think John Stark has a really good essay on that. I can't remember exactly what he said, but there's multiple essays in there that are really good about that particular question of how do you bust through the wall if people live in that sort of imminent frame and they don't have they're really not seeing outside of something that could be transcendent. How do we bust through that? That would be a good resource to go to. It's a few years old now, but still really, really helpful. So I'd point people to that rather than anything I might be able to say off the cuff. But just in hearing that question and thinking about that, I do think that the thirst for transcendence is still real, even though people wind up looking for it in places that don't provide it. So, for some people it's sex, for some people it's career, power, money, family, even like people recognize the need for something transcendent. And so they'll wind up searching for that significance and that feeling in other things. And then be disappointed because it's not delivering it. Right. So I mean, it's one of the reasons I think the sexual revolution has corresponded with the rise of secularism. It's like we're starved for transcendence, and so we seek that sort of transcendent experience. It's why sex is everything to some people. Like it's such an important thing because of what's expected from it. So I do think there's an avenue there of showing, hey, that whether people think there's really something transcendent or not, there's a search for that kind of transcendence, or at least that feeling of transcendence that can lead to to different polluted wells, I would say.
All right, next question. Where would you put the He Gets Us campaign as a marketing tool?
Yeah. I mean, I know some of the people involved with it. I've met Steve Green, and I think it's Steve, or the Hobby Lobby. It's either Steve or David. I get the Greens mixed up. They're all family. So,
It's
but
Steve. Yeah.
is it Steve? Yeah, Steve, Jackie. Okay, yeah. I just love them. They've done such great work with Museum of the Bible, and they've been great. I'm kind of one of these people that's like all about like multiple approaches to, of trying to see things. I can see why someone might hear what I said about marketing and think that am against any sort of awareness campaign or trying to stir up conversations kind of thing. I don't think He Gets Us I could be wrong about this. I don't think it's meant to be an evangelistic campaign. It's meant to be a pre-evangelistic campaign. I think that's an important distinction. It's meant to, I think, stir up conversations that then leads people to connect with various churches and things, and like get conversations going. And I already has riled up people. I've seen a lot of people upset about it from the church side. I think it was like the Super Bowl night. I was like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was going crazy about it's the saying we should love our fascist neighbors and things like that, or whatever. I can't remember what she said, but so it's there's just people getting riled up for various reasons for it. And I mean, and there's something to be said. You can talk about almost anybody in the public square, but you talk about Jesus, and it's just people get offended really, really fast. I think it's N.T. Wright who said, British theologian said, wherever Paul went, there was a riot. Wherever I go, we drink tea, like just like there's that, we almost have like so domesticated the gospel that there aren't enough riots happening because of what it is that we're actually teaching. But part of that's because the Christianity's already transformed the world so much, the Western world. So there's plenty of riots in certain parts of the world you go to because of Christianity. But yeah, so I've seen people also talking a little bit about, is this a good use of money? Should it be going to educational institutions instead? Or should it be should we be funding, this initiative or that initiative, or putting, to me, hey, different people with different gifts and skills are going to, try to make an impact in the ways that they think best. And it's kind of like the Asbury awakening and other things. I'm praying for good fruit. I mean, are there problems with this part or that part or this thing or that? Yeah. Like it's all messy, but I'm praying for good fruit, no matter what people are trying. So.
All right. As we consider not unmooring truth from beauty and goodness, is it helpful to major on the fact that the truth of Christianity actually reshapes what we find to be good and beautiful, and even what works?
Oh, absolutely. This is one of the reasons why some of you may have heard this before. There's the statement out there that, the key to evangelism and reaching your culture is to listen carefully for the question that the culture is asking, and then to answer that question with the gospel. I love that quote, but I have a caveat here. The gospel doesn't just give you an answer to the culture's question. The gospel also gives you different questions. You know, if people in the culture are no longer thinking about transcendence or heaven, hell, afterlife, things like that, eternity, just because they aren't thinking of those things, and that's not the way in when we're talking with people about the gospel, doesn't mean those questions don't need to be brought up at some level. So that would be my caveat there, and I would and leading to what the questioner asked about, you know, about what you're asking there about what's good and beautiful. You can't simply take whatever the culture thinks of as good and beautiful and then like hook Christianity to that. You have to recognize that some of what we see as good and beautiful is already because of Christianity. Like the idea of self-sacrifice and humility that we tend to look at in our day and think is beautiful, that was not beautiful for humility in the way we think of it today was not beautiful for, like, you know, the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks before Jesus. Like some of what we recognize as good and beautiful is already because of the cultural impact of Christianity. So, and I think we've got to be able to show people why they think the way they think. This is what we're going to, I don't want to jump ahead too far, but next week, when we talk about the challenge of morality, we're going to be looking in particular at one of the big challenges we find today is the fact that Christian morality, we are seeing a rebellion against Christian morality by people who have Christian infused sensibilities and don't know it. So anyway, that's for next week. But that's part of the challenge. One of the big challenges we face.
All right. Could you comment on Jesus's observation that love is the greatest apologetic to the world, that the Father sent the Son? It seems that the church has to model and teach better how to love/relate to people in a way that cuts across postmodern beliefs.
Yeah. Love as being the final apologetic is what Francis Schaeffer called it. But notice when Jesus says that that's the way that people will know we are Christians and that's the way people will know the truth, he's talking about the love of the church itself, like the Christians in community. See how they love one another. So I think that's, I think that's the starting point first. Obviously, we have to also love our neighbors, love our enemies, love opponents. Like we've got to love outside of our immediate circles. The circle gets widened. I mean, look at the good Samaritan and the parables Jesus tells and whatnot. But one of the first and most important things that the church is supposed to see is love on display in the Christian community. It's supposed to be one of the biggest draws. I'm a little discouraged when I think about how a lot of times the church just publicly does not demonstrate this very well. So just to make it an understatement, but I do think the church is better at this in local communities than it appears to be online, where people attack each other relentlessly for all sorts of things. So I do think in local communities there is a display of love that it can be really compelling to outsiders. But the picture that Jesus has is the love of the triune God spilling out and into and over the love of the church, God's people for each other, which then draws people, and then they encounter the love of the Christian community for them. That's sort of the image. So it's God's love, God's people's love, and then spreading out to the world. But yeah, this is key for what it means for us to be followers of Jesus. So yeah, I mean, you don't get all your systematic theology. You can get your systematic theology right and your apologetic strategies perfectly in line. And yet if you don't have love, you know, the clanging cymbal comes to mind, right? So.
All right, next question. How do we invest in having a dialogue in church communities, in our church communities, to help educate people to think critically, since it has become much harder to be a nominal Christian?
Can you say that one more time, or did you put
All
that
right.
in the chat? Let me
Yep.
see.
So, how do we invest in having a dialogue in our church communities to help educate people to think critically, since it's become harder to be a nominal Christian?
Um, yeah, I mean, well, I'm struggling to think of like what's the answer here, except just, I'm sorry, just like catechism and discipleship, thinking like going back to the basics of the faith, what it means for us to follow Jesus, all of that. I, I think we assume we do more of that than we actually do sometimes. And one of the things we find is that there's just a really a shocking level of biblical and religious illiteracy in even in our churches. So um uh you to fix that though, we've got to start with the question of how do we get people recognizing the need for this, or sensing the need for it. And uh yeah, I think the challenge that we face is that sometimes it's the nominal Christian who doesn't sense the need, and it's those who are like on calls like this that sense the need and want the church to drill down deeper. Um, yeah, that's really the question for me isn't what do we do with nominal Christians. The question for me is how do we help more nominal Christians, or that may attend church occasionally or whatnot. How do we help them feel the need for this? That's the bigger question. And I don't know the answer to that exactly. It's going to depend person to person, I think.
It's great. Next question. Do you think small churches make it easier to love each other well and to publicly demonstrate as a church family? Or do you think those make it easier to stay focused on core identity and mission?
Um, I think there are strategic things that small churches can do that larger churches have a harder time doing, but I don't think that love among the community is necessarily one of them. I've seen lots of really dysfunctional, challenging small churches, and I've seen really large churches that, because of the way that they structure things and the way they break down things into groups and they have pastoral leadership and whatnot, actually do a really good job of connecting people and getting people into to great community. So what I would say though is that if you're a part of a smaller church, and by small I mean the vast majority of churches across the world are less than 200, even the majority are less than 100. So don't feel like you're abnormal or that you're not necessarily doing something right, especially depending on the situation or the location you're in. I'm trying to encourage small church pastors constantly. The real key is who are you investing in and involving? There was a comment a few years ago from a megachurch pastor about how unless you have a great youth ministry like in the megachurch, you're gonna lose the students. You got to have, it's got to be like top notch, excellent all the way through. And he like apologized later for saying that, but I remember when he said it, I was like, just don't think that's true. I know plenty of people that walked away from the church that were in like really like bells and whistles youth ministry kind of stuff, and then I know young people that were in smaller churches that were basically leading worship, doing the sound booth, doing Sunday school for kids and who are already serving, who are some of the best servants of the church today. So I just don't think that you can really look at small versus large and say one's better than the other. I think there's strengths and weaknesses that you've got to figure out how you adopt them strategically for the mission.
All right. Often in youth ministry world, while we're on that subject, sharing personal testimonies is the singular and most accessible approach to evangelism. In an increasingly hostile world, can you give suggestions on how teenagers can grow in clarity, confidence, and courage to cross over from personal testimony to proclaiming and defending the resurrection and incarnation?
Yeah, you got to make it an adventure. I mean, this is what I've tried with our kids anyway, is that you got to make it an adventure. They got to know going from the beginning, this is an adventure. Evangelism is an adventure, and it takes guts and it takes boldness. It takes boldness if you do this to talk with a stranger, but it takes boldness if you talk with a friend, and the testimony is the first place, and a great, again, like I said, good starting point. It's just not the end. And that's if that's all you can get someone to do at the beginning, that's all they're comfortable with, fine, go there. Like level 1, right? But then you got to get up, you want to level up, right? If we want to gamify this a bit, you want to level up. So start with the personal testimony. That's fine. If that's basically as far as they'll get. Level 2 is connecting it to what Jesus Christ has done, starting to talk about that. Like, what does it mean? What we actually believe, ask people what they think about Jesus. Like ask people about the resurrection, like getting to those questions. That's level 2. And then level 3 is when you get to that point after you've had generally multiple conversations where you're going to actually invite someone to cross the threshold. Are you ready to turn from your sin and trust in Jesus Christ? That is in our day and age, that is the boldest and the hardest line. There are a lot of people that have, and we talk a lot about, in my denomination, we talk a lot about gospel conversations, which I love. Let's have more and more gospel conversations, but you really haven't fulfilled like the evangelistic task until you get to that point where you're asking someone, you're calling them to actually repent and believe, to turn from sin, to turn to Jesus in faith. Usually it's multiple conversations. Rarely am I in a spot where I'm doing all 3 levels in one conversation. Sometimes it's personal testimony level, and that's it. Sometimes it's personal testimony with gospel presentation, and that's where we get, because that's where the person is. But at some point, crossing the line, and that's where the adventure is the greatest, because then you're putting someone, like, the stakes are eternal there. So I would talk about it as a gutsy, adventurous thing to do. Don't make it sound easy. Let people know it's hard. Because if you tell them it's super easy and then they get into it and it's really hard, they're going to be like, they're going to think something's wrong with them. And I'm like, no, it's not easy in our day and age to do this, but the reward is amazing when someone does trust Christ. And even when someone doesn't, you don't know what seed you planted, how you've put them in a spot where, other people may carry along that conversation. You just got to trust God's at work, and you're just one of the people he's working through.
All right, this will be our final question for the night. I've done evangelism recently, and there seems to be no effect, almost like a blank stare, when I mention sin, morality, or truth. So what approach should we take? Should we focus on how the gospel provides us the way of human flourishing? And if so, how do we balance between what is practical and a social gospel with respect to all that Christianity is, to have a better life and the reality of Christianity as a morally relevant worldview? I'm going to put that one in the chat. I'm going to read it one more time. Yeah. I've done evangelism recently, and there seems to be almost no effect, a blank stare, when I mention sin, morality, and truth. What approach should we take? Should we focus on how the gospel provides a way of human flourishing? If so, how do we balance what's practical and what's social gospel, and the reality of Christianity as a morally relevant worldview?
So I'm going to point to a few resources really quick that I think are helpful here. First of all, the answer to that is not a formula that you're going to use for every person. You got to listen carefully to the person you're talking to. So Jonathan Dotson has a book called The Unbelievable Gospel, which talks about the different aspects of the atonement in the gospel. So everything from a justification to adoption to, different aspects of the atonement, to be able to hear really carefully where a person is, and then be able to decide which entry point into the gospel do you want to use, what's going to be most effective. So it's called The Unbelievable Gospel. It's Jonathan Dotson. Sam Chan has a book called Evangelism in a Skeptical World, but I think he has a newer one called like How to Talk About Jesus or something like that. Sam Chan is really good at listening carefully and then figuring out how to do this. And then if you want a resource where trying to start off with those areas of anxiety rather than starting off immediately with sin, this is what I was trying to do in my book, Rethink Yourself. Like I don't, in fact, I don't even call sin until later in the book. I call it the selfish impulse early on. Cause I'm just, again, I'm trying to like not use churchy words. I'm trying to just like help guide people into like the truth of the gospel in a way that's going to be heard. And I've had some people that are non-Christians have talked to me about that book, and it's been really enlightening, the conversations back and forth about the way it gets to the gospel eventually, but the kind of the entry point in. And I was writing that at some level to help people have some hooks to think through in their own evangelistic conversations.
Well, that's it for the questions tonight. Thank you to just everybody who's. I'm just so encouraged by everybody who's here. The breadth of traditions and every other way that the body of Christ could be conceived of or imagined. This is just so good, and I was edified by this content here. Yeah, so you'll get a recap email from me, most likely tomorrow. My kids are all sick, so everything's melting down in my household. Anybody else got stomach bugs running through their through their families? Been a rough week in the Graham household. Anyways, we'll see everybody next week. And Skylar, you can go ahead and kill the cloud recording. It's good to see everybody. And again, if you need anything, you can email me. At the email here, I'm going to put in the chat, which is just kellercenter@tgc.org, if you need anything. So it's there for you if you need me.
Night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Kevin, sit tight. I'm asking Trevin to jump back in here for a second. Skylar, can you kill the recording?